Welcome to the Album Anniversary Podcast. Today's show is about Sticks and Stones by the 77s, and it was released sometime in 1990, so we're taking this opportunity to celebrate its 35-year anniversary. I'm your host, Caleb, or Caleb Spy on Twitter and Instagram, and every day on those social media sites, I post about what I call album anniversaries. So, on the Album Anniversary Podcast, we take a look at a classic album on the anniversary of its release date, or in this example, don't know the release date, we've just chosen today to celebrate an album. This show is a chance to talk about why we love an album, why an album may be important to us. Albums on the show often are focused on alternative rock, punk, or my strange obsession with ska. In the 90s, I was super into the Christian music scene, so that comes up often on the show. And today, I'm joined by Kit to answer 5 simple questions about Sticks and Stones by the 77s. Kit, welcome back to the show. It's good to have you back.
Thank you. Yeah, good to be back.
You had joined me for the June 15th extravaganza, or hot mess, whatever you want to call that show. The train wreck of trying to talk about too many albums on one show. On that show, you were there to talk about Michael Knott, and it was great to have you. That's one of my favorite records from that day, so I was super excited to get somebody. That show, because we kind of went so fast, we didn't do a whole lot of catch up or kind of get to know you sort of thing. So I do like to try and start with that. So were you raised in a house around music, or just kind of what's kind of a little bit of your musical journey as a fan of music?
There was music in my family, but nobody in my family was a musician. When I was 7 years old, 7 or 8 years old, I had kind of an interest in music. I would buy up things like I didn't buy anything. My parents bought it for me. Well, like a Xanadu soundtrack and Urban Cowboy and Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton and stuff like that. And
Sure.
I was into this. This was like early 80s, and I had an interest in it for a little bit. And then all of a sudden, I don't know what it was about the early 80s, like when MTV came into the picture, but it was just like the second British invasion. It's also around the time that my parents became Christians. And I felt like kind of disconnected from all of that. Everybody looked weird. They had weird haircuts and, barely clad women in the videos. I felt disconnected from it. And that's also around the time I got into like action figures and then later on video games. So I pretty much spent the 80s, not really listening to music, but just if I did listen to it, I was just kind of listening to what my friends listened to at the time, which was anything like Michael Jackson and Madonna or
Sure.
whatever they were listening to. It wasn't until around 1990 that I kind of discovered music again. And it was Christian music that I originally started getting into. It started with like Michael W. Smith's Eye to Eye. And then I just kind of explored from there as I got more interested in mainstream groups like Depeche Mode and U2 and New Order and NXS and Erasure. I started kind of looking for Christian music that was kind of the same thing, and it just kind of snowballed from there, really.
Yeah, and that's right when, 1990, I do think that's a great time to get into it because, there was some stuff in the 80s. Steve Taylor's been doing his thing, but you
Yeah.
go a little earlier and there's a lot less, I think. Like once you hit there is a turning point and a tipping point where all of a sudden your options are just so much better. Were you in a location where you were able to go, like we had a Christian club that would like bring bands through? Were you able to see bands or go to like big music festivals? Or was that something in your area that was a possibility?
It was pretty lacking. Like we had
Hmm.
whoever our youth pastor would have. Like
Okay.
I saw one of like the first Newsboys concerts that ever happened in the U.S.
Crazy.
Because they were touring. They hadn't even released Boys Will Be Boys. I think the
Hmm.
latest thing they had out was Hell Is for Wimps, which is a terrible album title. But yeah, they did that show, and he had like hip hop groups come over. Like ETW was when
Hmm.
he had a lot. And that was like in 1990, like hip hop was probably one of the more exciting things happening
Hmm.
because, it was either that or like a lot of mullet rock and arena rock or hair
Yeah.
metal. That was what was big back then. There was a lot of it. I was more about the alternative stuff, and it was just really difficult combing through the mountains of demo tapes at Christian bookstores because that's how we Spotify back then. You know,
Yeah.
those demo cassettes. You probably did that too.
Yeah.
And yeah, I would get really frustrated just because it was one of those things where you could tell how bad something was going to be by looking at the album cover. You know, you don't say judge a book by its don't judge a book by its cover, but I felt like in that case, like if they had like mullets with hair down to their shoulders and bolo ties and stuff like that, you could tell that it wasn't going to be very good. And
Yep.
it was just hard to find really good stuff back then.
Yeah. I mentioned I did a show about Sin by Poor Old Lou, and
Yeah,
that was one of those examples of like it jumped off the shelf. Like that cover was like, what is this? And it jumped out, and like it was kind of like I didn't know that it was gonna be, a guaranteed win because I don't know if you had this experience. You had those demo tapes, right? Where you could, some they'd open some stuff at the Christian bookstore that you could go and listen
yeah,
to. But some stuff they didn't have demo tapes for. And so there were times where
exactly.
we were pulling stuff off the shelf going, I hope this is good. I hope this
Yeah,
is worth my $18. And sometimes it wasn't.
yeah. Sometimes it was not. Yes,
Yeah.
I can name very specific examples of that.
Oh, I'd like to hear these. I have one too. What just one example? It's okay. You're not bagging on them. It's just wasn't for you, right?
Yeah, yeah. To be fair, this band got better on subsequent records, but their first one, Hocus Peck,
Okay.
their first album was called Hocus Pick Maneuver, Pick It Up, and it just sounded really, I don't know, like just a band completely lacking in self-awareness. It's like their take on like evolution, was just, I don't know. It was
Yeah.
just very tough to listen to, especially as I would see them compared to groups like Chili Peppers and stuff like that, who
Yeah.
I actually liked at the time. Not so much now, but they just didn't sound like anything they were hyped up to be.
Yeah. My example always that we joke around it's still important in the sense, but it's that Wish for Eden Pet the Fish. I remember because the cover's kind of cool. Like it's in it's the first Tooth and Nail release. So I went on to love hundreds of Tooth and Nail bands. I mean, obviously Tooth and Nail was a big deal, but I do remember getting home and just being like, oh, this just doesn't do it for me. I think had probably pulled it off the shelf because it was, sounds like Nirvana, and I think it was just this does not sound like Nirvana, and
Yeah, I had the exact same opinion. Like you could tell the dude had a good rock voice, but he had these like really placeholder lyrics, and I just felt like the record lacked like the militant muscle of like a Helmet record, but it lacked the sophisticated harmonies of like an Alice in Chains record. So it's just kind of having this awkward spot where it didn't really appeal to a fan of either band. But some people really liked it,
yep,
and I don't know, it's not terrible, but
no,
I just it was just kind of lacking for me. But I do own a copy of it still. I mean, it was the first album released on Tooth and Nail, who obviously went on to
yeah.
destroy in that space. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I think it's a good example of one of those ones though, because it that one I think does resonate with so many people. I mean, it's just
yeah,
you mention it, and I'm still amazed. It celebrated a 30-year anniversary last year because I think it was released in 1993, and I posted about it, and there was a lot of people who were like, "Oh man, that was I think there are a lot of people who have that opinion of like it was fine, but what it meant for the scene." Because what Tooth and Nail meant for the scene,
yeah,
was just such a big deal. So
yeah.
yeah, it's so funny how many people you talk to who have this. I think we really thought our experience of the Christian bookstore and the demos and pulling stuff off the shelves was really unique. And the more people you talk to are like, nope, that's exactly what we did too. And you're like, oh, it's just something about that time frame. It's pretty amazing to
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
Well, with that out of the way, I say we jump in and tackle this record.
Cool.
Come on, let me in.
So, like I mentioned at the top of the show, we're talking about Sticks and Stones by the 77s. Now, this was released sometime in 1990. I've done my best. I cannot find an exact date, so I don't know it. So today's the day to
Yeah.
celebrate this album. It happens, especially with these older Christian albums. And if they weren't a mainstream, it's pretty tough to nail down a date.
Yeah. I don't remember. I don't remember either. I didn't even get into it until the following year.
Yeah, it probably was sometime in the summer. I mean, just that's also the nature of now that I've tracked all these release dates. It's an absolute bell curve. At the beginning of the year, there's almost nothing, and then June and July, it's crazy, and then it does dip back down again, and then there's a spike again September, October, and even November. There's a little bit of a spike towards the end of November. So
Yeah.
there is a little bit of a curve. So I doubt it was in January of 1990. So just that getting that out of the way up front. So it was their fourth album, and it was released on Broken Records, which I'll be totally honest, I am really unfamiliar with. Do you know any other bands that were kind of on Broken Records?
Yeah. The Choir and
Hmm.
Undercover, quite a few bands. I think Broken Records started in like the 80s, and they were kind of known in addition to Frontline and Exit Records as kind of forging a path into the more experimental, youth-oriented Christian music that
Hmm.
was like more punk and alternative, that kind of thing. But yeah,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure like a lot of Altar Boys. Oh, and I think like Adam Again put out some
Okay.
stuff on there. I think Broken eventually became Brainstorm.
Okay.
I think those two labels are connected somehow. I don't remember exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a label I saw a lot back then.
Okay. Well, it's funny because you mentioned Altar Boys, the 77s, where I was talking about the choir. Those are, in my opinions, those are forging the way for everything we got in the 90s. I mean, it's I say it all the time, and so I'm totally repeating myself, but like my biggest frustration with Christian musicians from the 90s is they put out some of the greatest Christian music ever, in my opinion. And I wish they would have talked about their forefathers. I think there should have been more conversation about that because I think they were so busy looking to their secular contemporaries, and there probably wasn't enough praise given to bands like the 77s and the Altar Boys and the Choir and those sorts of bands that really did pave the way. So that's
Yeah,
why I say it often. So I apologize to everybody for saying it over again, but it's so clear to me.
yeah,
This album was produced by Mike Rowe and Steve Griffith. I'm really good with last names. Those are the two names that I see on this. And Mike Rowe is the lead singer of the group. If you're not familiar, and then you had told me kind of about like the idea of Steve Griffith he's the lead singer of, I think you told me this maybe, of Velcor and
Vector.
Vector. Gosh, I'm
Yeah,
really good at pronouncing things. Vector. And he also started Liquid Disc Records in
yeah,
1994, which put out a
yeah.
lot of other stuff. So, do you know, was he's not in the band? Obviously, Mike is, but Steve isn't. Have they worked? Do you know if they've worked together a lot in the past, or if this was kind of a first time sort of thing?
Yeah, they were label mates. Exit Records was a brief label that lasted in the 80s.
Hmm.
I think it dissolved by the late 80s, but Vector and the 77s were key bands on that label. They both had like distribution deals through Mainstream Records.
Okay.
I think Vector put out one more album in the 90s. But yeah, they worked. I think Steve Griffith produced the 77 second album, All Fall Down. I, I,
Okay.
I could be wrong. I haven't looked at the credits in a while, but and I think Mike Rowe was involved in some extent on some of the Vector albums too.
Okay. Well, and Steve he's connected with a lot of people. So he worked with
Yeah,
Audio Adrenaline, he worked
yeah,
with Bride, Curious Fools, which I'm less familiar with, but I've definitely heard the name. He worked with the Prayer Chain, which one of the best in my opinion from the '90s Christian scene. He worked with the Choir, he worked with the Boys, and then he of course worked with the '77. So clearly a guy who had his hands in a lot of those early alternative bands. And Bride, I wouldn't call them an alternative band, and I wouldn't call Audio Adrenaline necessarily an alternative band. I think they're a pop band disguised as an alternative band, but they went on to obviously be a force in the scene as well. And but Steve clearly had his hands in a lot of bands from that time.
yeah, yeah, definitely. I didn't know he worked with the Prayer Chain though. I guess I never. I thought it was like Steve Hindalong that did all those, but maybe. maybe he was involved in some way I didn't know about.
Yeah, and it may not have been he may not have produced anything. It may have been, he helped with mixing or something like that.
Yeah, I get production and mixing and engineering, all those three things confused sometimes.
Well, and I think that's part of it, right? Is that you can have somebody who, comes in and does something, masters one song. I mean, that happens. Like you look through some of these credits, right? And it's like, oh, they worked with Dolly Parton. And it's like, oh, actually they
It's just
mastered
one
one
song.
song.
Yeah.
It looks like he worked on the Whirlpool EP.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
This album was released 3 years after I think their most classic, most well-known album. 77s is the name of it. It's self-titled, but I think it's always with the numbers on it. So that's often considered not just their best record, but I've seen it on the top of a couple greatest CCM albums of all time. So it does
Yeah.
come on the heels of that album, although 3 years later.
Sticks and Stones was basically a set of demos
Yep.
that didn't make other albums. Like some of those are as old as like early to mid 80s. I think Micro specifically stated "You Walked in the Room" was something they worked on back in 1984, and it kind of shows just compared to some of the others, it's a little bit more sonically crude. But yeah, it's basically a set of demos, which is why I'm surprised at like it has a consistent producer. Like I would think that they had different producers than Steve and Mike, but I guess it does make sense because I think he was involved in a lot of their other records anyway. So
Yep. Yeah, that's really interesting to me because I didn't know that going into this. That was one of those things that was on my list of like, oh, this is all previously recorded but unreleased songs. And so yes, it is what makes it really interesting to me, and we'll get into this in a little bit, is that it is an incredibly consistent record, I think. Like for being a collection of that sort of thing, it feels bigger than that, which is really, really interesting.
I always kind of scratch my head about that as well because I always thought the songs were really strong for something that they didn't consider to be appropriate for an album, or maybe they were appropriate and they just didn't release the album that they were intending to release before they broke up. But like the 77s, the core 80s membership was Micro, Aaron Smith, Mark Tootle, and Jan Erik. And Jan Erik and Mark left the band, I think, in the late 80s, and then they released Sticks and Stones. By that point, the 77s had a completely new lineup, but that
Yeah.
lineup wasn't on that record. So it was just kind of this weird transitional period that they put this album out, I think, to just kind of tide fans over before they started releasing new stuff. But I don't think they expected the reaction that they got
Yeah.
to the set of demos.
Yep. And I can't find a ton of like reviews from the time, but I will say I found a couple, and there was one I read he was like, I know this is, kind of speaking to this. He's like, I know this is a bunch of demos and previously unreleased stuff, but he's like, this is my favorite record by them. And so it is funny. Like, again, I know 77's, the record is considered their masterpiece in a lot of ways, but there are people out there who absolutely believe that this is their favorite by them,
Yeah.
which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, a very strong case could be made. I'd probably do like Sticks and Stones more than the first self-titled. They had two self-titles technically, but I do like this. This one's probably my favorite, but I don't know. That can change.
Yeah. Weezer's looking at them going, two self-titled, hold my beer. Because
Yeah,
we got 10 or so, however many they got at this
yeah,
point. So
yeah. The second self-title that they had was only a self-title because the record label wouldn't let them release the actual album title, Pray Naked. They
okay.
were like, no, we're not going to let you put that in a Christian bookstore. So they ended up being a self-title. But
Oh,
they
man.
actually did. They did give it the actual title, Pray Naked, later when they did a reissue. But anyway,
That'd be fun to get a collection of rejected Christian album names. There's probably some really great ones. It'd be hard to get the list, but man, that'd be a worthwhile collection. I'd love to see those names.
But your arms would always draw me back home. There is nowhere else I'd rather be than in your heart. There is nowhere else I wanna be
First question, how did you first discover this album?
Well, so back in again 1990, you're going through all the demo tapes, and I think this one kind of put me off for a while because I thought the album cover looked atrocious. Just at the time. I mean, I have more of a reference point as to what inspired the cover now, but I just thought it looked bland. I'm like, really, this is what they landed on? How could the music be any good? And I
Hmm.
just kind of avoided it a lot for that reason. I found out 15 years later that the cover is a direct parody of, well, a parody or homage, however you look at it, of a Little Richard album cover that came out in 1958.
Hmm.
Same exact font, same exact design. They just
Sure.
kind of twisted it. So that's why it looked like that,
Yeah.
which in retrospect is kind of rock and roll, actually. But yeah, I avoided it for a while. But a friend of mine kind of took a chance on it, and he brought it to my room one day and played it for me. And the first song is MT, which is the first song I ever heard by them, and it's just very catchy.
Hmm.
I mean, they were shooting straight for a radio hook on this one, and I loved it. And I think I dubbed it from them onto a cassette and listened to it over and over again. Never really listened to anything else from the album until way later. So
Hmm.
another friend of mine who was also kind of experimenting with Christian music, he bought the album and we would listen to it in his car. And after a couple plays, I was like, I really like this actually, and I think I dubbed the cassette from him and played it over and over again until my grandmother or somebody finally bought me the cassette for Christmas of '91. But yeah, that was just kind of how I got into it. For a while, the MT is the only song I knew, and I've found out, just here's some trivia. That song is actually owned by Fox.
Hmm.
Mike Rowe and the co-writer, his name's Bongo Bob Smith. I think, well, Mike sold his portion of it anyway to Fox, but he says they own it lock, stock, and barrel.
Hmm.
But it appeared in an episode of 9210, but it wasn't the 77's version. It was like some other. I think his name is Zoppy.
Okay.
His version of it was playing while the cast was. It was like a pool scene or something.
Okay.
It's a really catchy tune, and it's for a while the only one I knew. But eventually I got into the whole entire album.
Well, for me, it's a lot more boring answer. I kind of mentioned it before we started recording, but like I had probably seen this around. I feel like the cover is very striking, and so I feel like I had seen it, and I had heard of the 77s, but I had never given it a deep listen until really this, kind of preparing for this show. I think I had listened to it last year when it'd come up on the anniversary on the calendar because it's been on I added it to my
Yeah.
calendar based on recommendations. So this was really my first deep dive into it, and so embarrassingly late. But that is the name of my autobiography will be embarrassingly late because I feel like I'm embarrassingly late on everything. But yeah, so that's my story about how I kind of discovered this album. It really is more recent. So
Oh, I'm a late comer to a lot of things, so I can't really
yeah,
judge.
I'm late on everything. It's embarrassing.
Keeping your love warm. Hey! This is the way love is. This is the way love is. Man, it's a one-sided double-minded mirror with no reflection. Hey, this is the way love is. This is the way love is. And it's a one-sided double-minded mirror with no reflection.
What do you love about this album?
When you listen to it, you can tell it's not arranged for like maximum flow and effect. They have like this, Jerry Lee Lewis boogie woogie barn burner type song right before like the saddest song you've ever heard.
Yep.
So it's just you're not really under the impression that they arrange the album to flow a certain way, but it's just they're all really strong songs in their own way. They don't really sound. There's not really a single song that sounds alike. You have MT, which is like the big single, and then you have the song that comes after it, Nowhere Else, which is kind of this uplifting song that you play in a long car ride on a summer day and a empty highway. And then they have This Is the Way Love Is, and then you have the real bluesy Jerry Lee Lewis sounding song. You have a really sad, sorrowful U2 type song, and then
Yeah.
side B is You Walked in the Room, which sounds like a cross between like Julian Cope and Echo and the Bunnymen, and then you have The Days to Come, which is kind of like early 80s U2. And then you have this weird, awkward instrumental that comes out of nowhere. And then you have God Sends Quails, which is probably, I tend to prop up as my favorite track.
Hmm.
And then you kind of end it on an inspirational note. So, it's kind of, it's all over the place. There's not really one particular style on the whole album. It's just all
Yeah.
about songcraft, really, in my opinion.
Yep.
And the 77s are a band. They didn't always get it right, but when they got it right, they really got it right. And in my opinion, they got it right pretty much 90% of this thing.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's interesting about this album is that because it is demos or kind of previously unreleased, I like how there's a lot of space to breathe on a lot of these songs. Like, because it almost feels like, hey, let's record it. I don't love it. And if they would have, if they would have been like, well, let's put this on a record, they may have trimmed some of it, right? Or they may have squished it down. But I feel like a lot of these songs really just give space to just be a song. And there's instrumental space that's not a solo, and it's not it's not a bridge, or it's just there because it feels good. And I miss that in music. I feel like songs have become such, if you're not singing or soloing or transitioning to something else, it's not in a song anymore. You got to get them out. And I like short songs. I mean, I'm a punk rock guy and I like that, but I love on this album that there's just space for stuff to breathe. It really works over and over again.
Yeah, they have some short songs, they have some long songs, but the thing about the 77s, there's always, it's always been asserted that there's like the big four alternative bands, or Daniel Amos, Adam Again, The Choir, and the 77s. Now, the first three, they all had kind of a very similar stylistic thread in all their music. Like The Choir tends to be more dreamy and shoegazy. Adam Again tends to be funky, alternative, and then Daniel Amos, they started off country and then they ended up becoming like, new wave. But there was, those bands were like consistent genre wise. The 77s are kind of all over the place. Like they digested a smorgasbord of like different rock styles, everything from jazz to blues to, jangle pop to new wave. And they just kind of, used those genres as a touchstone for their songcraft. Because I just, if there's one thing that's usually identifiable with the 77s, is that's where their strength is just straightforward songcraft.
Yeah. I also like on this album that I feel like there's a lot of love songs on it. And I like it. I don't know. It was a super enjoyable album to listen to. And one review I had read that said that was kind of a transition. Like a lot of their other albums are a little more not as uplifting, and this one was. And so, but I don't have that history with it, but either way, I liked how many love songs were on it. It was just, I don't know, I thought it was good. They just wrote really good love songs that were not poppy by any means, but pop influenced enough that you could make them work. And so I really liked all the love songs, which is so weird for me to say, but there it is.
Yeah, it's not particularly obvious that the love songs are about God. I think most of them are. If I like, Nowhere Else, that was written by Mark Tootle. I think that's about God, and I think This Is the Way Love Is no, This Is the Way Love Is has some weird lyrics. Like there's the part of the chorus always kind of confused me, because I think it goes, this is the way love is when it's a one-sided, double-minded mirror with no reflection. I had no idea what that meant. Like I asked my bro once, like in a 77s message board, like what it means. Is like, I don't know, you'd have to ask Mark. But yeah, it seems like it's about how, the 77s were never particularly upfront about their Christian themes, but I can tell the song is about how God puts more into the relationship than you do. Like the narrator, the singer of the song is just kind of admitting to that.
Yeah.
But I mean, you can't always necessarily tell that they're singing to God on the song. And the last song, Love Without Dreams, that one's, that's a pretty straightforward love song. I think it's just they're just basically saying you can't have love without dreams.
Yeah.
You can't go into love with practicality. It has to come from the heart.
Yeah.
And I'm not even sure. To this day, I'm not even really sure who MT is about. I don't know. It could be about anything.
Yeah.
Could be about God. Could be about
Well, I got used in 90210, so
yeah,
vague enough that you can put it in that spot, and people are going to be kind of go with it. So yeah.
I think it might even be from the perspective of God.
Hmm.
I haven't examined the lyrics to that one in quite a while.
Well, and I have not examined deep enough on any of the lyrics, so you could probably say whatever you want, and I'm not going to question you. This is your chance. Just run with it, and
Yeah.
we can send it to Mike and see if he what he thinks. So
Like a blackbird that won't sing. Imagine throwing into the air, but it falls from broken wings. Don't leave this way. So many words unsaid. Don't lie this way. Stretch.
why is this album important to you? And if it's not something that's important to you, although I think it might have some importance to you, why is this something that holds up? I mean, 35, right? I got my math right. 35 years later, why is this something that still holds up?
I don't know, like I discovered it in 1991, and at the time I was really seeking out authentic, Christian music of the alternative variety, or just new wave or synth pop variety, and this is one of the few that stuck. I mean, right around the time Vaughn Vinyl was coming out, they were releasing some good stuff. But this one just kind of stuck, and I never really got away from it. Like I just keep coming back to it. I mean, maybe over the past couple of years I haven't played it quite as much, but like the 77s were my favorite band for like 15 years before I discovered Ecstasy, and I always consider Sticks and Stones to be my favorite just for various reasons.
Yeah.
Like every song on that album has at one point probably been my favorite song, except for the loop.
Okay.
Yeah, like I think Perfect Blues for a while, which I did not like at first. When I was a kid, I just thought it sounded like old fashioned and dinosaur rockish. But as I started to like listen to the whole thing, I'm like, wow, this thing actually rocks, because their drummer, Aaron Smith, he just murders behind the kit. And he was a card carrying member of Motown. Like he had his own card. He played on Papa Was a Rolling Stone by the Temptations. And then he also, later on, he was in Romeo Void, which is another big band in the 80s. And then he joined the 77s and basically played with them during their prime, which is usually considered 1984 to 1994. And then he went on to play with like Michael W. Smith, DC Talk, Rich Mullins, and he played on like Jesus Freak, a lot of those main records. Just an incredible drummer. And Perfect Blues is like a perfect example of that. Like he doesn't really show off too much. He knows how to draw attention to himself without purposefully drawing attention to himself. He's just a fantastic drummer. And that song was like that's when I used to scrabble back in the day. I tend to notice that song kind of sat in the number one spot for a while. But even though I really disliked it as a kid, I would skip it all the time. I would be in my parents' van, and it had the technology to find like the space between songs on cassettes. I would fast forward through it and go straight to Don't This Way. But I love it now.
Yeah.
It sounds like something like Jim Jones Review would do, or again, I guess Jerry Lee Lewis is probably the most obvious touchstone on that album. I mean, on that song. Yeah. But in the liner notes, they talk about how they had to use like multiple tracks to do the piano part, because there's kind of a piano solo on it, and none of them. I don't think there was. I think Mark Tootle does the keys for the band, but they had to like do multiple tracks to get the piano part that they were doing on that song.
So you mentioned this was at one point your favorite album. Is this still? Yes. I mean, if you're redoing your, if you're calling out your top 10 albums, does this make it into the top 10 still?
It would be in the top 5 for sure. Maybe even number 2 spot. I still really like it, but I just XTC kind of took over my.
Well, you're allowed to change your mind. That's fine.
Yeah. But yeah, I still do really like it. I bought the remaster. I bought the vinyl. I have the T-shirt. I'm afraid to wear the T-shirt because I don't want to, mess it up. So it just kind of hangs in my closet.
That's funny. Yeah, I can totally get it because, like, again, my exposure is much less. It's much more new. But like, you listen to this and it feels again like I think about the 90s alternative rock scene in general. Like, this is 1990. You've kind of come out of in my opinion, some of the big players of the 90s, or the 80s, the things that really stand out to me for alternative rock are, you know, Husker Du, The Replacements, and
Yeah.
you know, those sorts of things. And that's probably a bit of the Minnesota kid in me. I want those to be the standalones, but there's tons of other ones, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there is kind of this weird transition where like 90s turns into the grunge thing, and they're not that, but they're not all new wave. Like I had a hard time
Yeah.
figuring out the genre. I ended up going and being like, what is the genre for this now? Because I was like, this is really all over. So it's really cool to hear you say like they were a bit more, I want to say eclectic, you know, that they just
Yeah.
kind of went with a lot of different things. They didn't feel defined maybe by a genre. And I think that's what makes this great. I love alternative rock that does that. I think there are so many bands that were like, well, this is what we're going to do. And now we just need to stick with this sound. And like, I don't think there's anything wrong with being like, oh, we're going to dabble in a little of this and dabble in a little of that. Like, if you're going to have a career that's that long and every single one of your albums is just the same thing over and over again, yeah, that doesn't work for every band. It works for some. Some bands seem to be able to pull it off, but so I'm all for that, and I really think it holds up really really well as something that you can listen to, and there's enough little like new wavy things here and the rock and roll stuff here, and that it just all works really really well to kind of keep it together, even though there's a lot of variety on it.
Yeah, they did kind of expand their horizons into the more, I don't know, like the grungy type stuff
Sure.
on Drowning with Land in Sight, but they had their own take on it with mixed results. But yeah, they attempted almost every rock genre in some way. Like they even like there was a song on the self-titled album that Mike Rowe says was directly inspired by the Cramps,
Hmm.
kind of a gothic, a rockabilly type band,
Sure.
which isn't typically what the 77 sound like. But yeah, they just took almost every rock style and just mix it a bit and add their own flavor to it.
Yeah. You know, as a kid or as a younger person, were the lyrics something that stood out to you as something that kind of like helped kind of attach you to this, or was it more just the music? Because I think it can happen both ways, right? I mean, and everybody's got their things that draw them in.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think as a kid, like even my more that was kind of a more youth group evangelical time for me. But even back then, like I was drawn more to artists who were relatable
Hmm.
and weren't so much, evangelical. And I never really was under the impression that the 77s were trying to be evangelical. But you could tell there was like a germ of faith there. And I appreciated the way they sang about things without being too direct. They kind of left things open to
Yeah.
interpretation, but you can tell what they were trying to say. But they weren't being obvious about it. And one of the things that Mike Rowe likes to sing a lot about is human failure.
Hmm.
That's like one of his favorite topics. He explored it in greater detail on later albums, but like God Sends Quails tends to be my favorite song from that album. And also Mike Rowe has since acknowledged that he does realize the plural for quail is quail, not quails. But yeah, it's called God Sends Quails. It's like the ninth track on the album. It's the theme of that song is well, the chorus goes, "You can't go back, you can't go back, you can't go on," and it's just kind of acknowledging that you can really screw up your past, and you can't necessarily change that, or you can't even really reconcile every mistake you've made and correct it, but you can forge a path forward. And I think that's kind of a universal message, no matter what you believe in. And I think that's kind of the lyrical approach I think Mike Rowe was trying to do, along with other, and he's not the only artist to do that. Like even, other bands in the mainstream were kind of that way. That's kind of how U2 and Bono were. That's kind of how The Call was. Mainstream bands were taking that approach too. He just didn't really reap the financial rewards,
Sure.
because I think back then, I think Christian music was expected to be more upfront
Yeah.
with your faith, whereas and we kind of talked about this when Michael Knott was kind of the same way.
Yeah. Well, and in 1990, so just really pinning this down, like if you were touring as a Christian band, it was churches. Like that was your only option. There was that,
Yeah.
that I don't think that club thing had taken off to that point where there was, because in the 90s there became that, right? There was places you could go and you could actually tour, and you were still probably doing 50% churches and then 50%, or maybe it was, I don't know, I'm making up percentages. You were probably maybe still occasionally hitting the random bar that would bring in, but the majority of your places were churches and then these Christian clubs that became part of the industry. And so, like, yeah, there was an expectation. Like, if you're playing a church in 1990 and you weren't fairly explicit about your Jesus, you probably, it was probably a hard sell.
Yeah, they the 77s were definitely swinging for the fences commercially. Like they were really trying to land the commercial deal, and they played. I mean, again, I wasn't really around for the 80s, but they played all the main clubs
Hmm.
in like LA and stuff like that. They ended up just getting like really crappy distribution deals. Like they would
Yep.
be on Exit Records in the Christian market, and then they would get distribution to A&M for one record, and then they would get distribution to Island for another record. And like Island Records, they released the 77's self-titled album 2 weeks before, or maybe it was a week before Joshua Tree came out.
Hmm.
So you can guess which record they got behind. And I think they
Yeah.
just kind of expected the 77s to ride the coattails of U2's success, which obviously didn't happen. But also I would hear stories like like Island promoted a couple of songs from like the 77 self-titled album, but some of the people within the company were just like they're a Christian rock band, that's all they're going to be,
Yeah.
like they just they just kind of gave up.
Yep. At the time, that makes sense, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I just don't think that it wasn't quite yet. It was a couple more years before those record execs realized, wow, we can make a lot of money off these people, and
Yeah,
that changed it. You know?
yeah, it probably took Heart in Motion by Amy Grant. I think that was kind of ground zero for that. I think
Yep. Yep.
I could be wrong because she had some success in the 80s, but it just seemed kind of like there was this I don't know, something started right
Yep.
around that time.
Yep. I mean, that's still as of 2019, that's still the biggest selling CCM album of all time. Well, we started getting into it a little bit, but you already mentioned God Sends Quail. We'll correct it for him. No, God Sends Quails. So you already mentioned some of the songs. We've talked about a lot of them, but if you had to pick your favorite songs off this, what are some of them? And I know sometimes it gets hard to not say all of them. I fall into that trap as well. But what are a couple of your favorite songs that people should check out from this album?
Well, the one that tends to be again the one that tends to reel people in is MT because
Yep.
it's the hookiest of all of them. Like they were definitely aiming for a hit. Like he even says in the liner notes, he says something like "Write us a hit, Bongo," which is the guy who co-wrote it with
Yeah.
them. And I don't know why. What's the story with that one as far as like why it never ended up on an album? It might have just been one they did after they realized that there was no future for the band at that time or something. But that is probably the catchiest one. Another one that's really that tends to be considered a stunner is "Don't This Way."
Hmm.
It drags out a little long, but it's just I don't know. Roe describes it as the saddest song he's ever heard.
Hmm.
He didn't write it. Mark Tootle did,
Okay.
but it's kind of like U2 sounding, but just really sad. It has this sorrowful guitar line all throughout. I mean, I don't remember liking it immediately when I heard it, but just after a couple of listens, I probably considered that one of my favorite for a while.
Hmm.
It's about loss. Like they're obviously talking about somebody who's dying
Hmm.
or something like that. Don't lie this way, stretch straight from feet to head. Don't look this way, closed eyes, unmoving lips. Don't feel this way, cold hands and fingertips. I think they're talking about somebody who's dead.
Hmm.
And then the other I really like You Walked in the Room.
Hmm.
I mean, it's a bit sonically crude compared to the rest of them, but they fixed that on the remaster.
Hmm.
It's just again, it sounds kind of like a cross between like Echo and the Bunnymen and Julian Cope, and you could tell that they really like their jangle pop. They really like their
Yeah.
Smiths, but they also really like their Stones. So that's a pretty strong one melodically. But again, the one that I tend to like the most is God Sends Quails. That's another long one. It's like 6 minutes long. It
Yep.
starts off with this like 2 minute jammy intro. It used to annoy me back in the day, but now I don't mind it so much. I really like it now, actually. And it just has, it's just sprawling in a very good way. It has a really dreamy bridge. Not dreamy as in, like tremolo guitars and echoey guitars, but just really dreamy and relaxing.
Yeah.
Even though the subject matter is pretty dark. But I would say those are the four. But I mean, those are the four that I would say serve as a good introduction. But if you like rock, maybe put on Perfect Blues.
Yeah. I really like it feels like to me, and again, way less experience with this, but like The Days to Come and God Sends Quails are when I got a little bit more of that new wave sound, and I felt like it kind of worked. Although I will say God Sends Quails also there's moments within it, like, because I think there's a guitar solo at one point that I kind of scribbled down the note that it feels like a real classic rock as well, which is a really interesting dynamic that it has made me think new wave and classic rock at the same
Yeah,
time.
yeah. Roe was compared to Mark Knopfler a
Hmm.
lot from Dire Straits. Even though it's weird, I heard a story that well, Roe's been playing guitar for a long time, like even before like Dire Straits like put out their first album, and people he told some kind of story about how a friend of his heard Dire Straits on the radio. He's like, this guy sounds like you, Mike.
Hmm.
So he does kind of get compared to Mark Knopfler because they have kind of a very melodic way playing. But yeah, you're right. It does kind of sound like progressive rock colliding with new wave a lot on that album. I
Yeah.
mean, you could say that about a lot of '80s albums though. Like that's what songs from the Big Chair sounds like to me. It's just like it just encompasses everything about the '80s. You have the soaring guitar solos, the sax solos, and the
Yeah.
synthesizers.
Yeah.
But yeah, you could tell that they like their progressive rock, they like their new wave, they like their jangle pop, and they like their blues rock. They're all over the place. You'll have all these different stylistic combinations fused into one perfect pop song.
Yeah. And I'll mention, 'cause I don't know if it's the actual closer, but I feel like Love Without Dreams, if it's not the closer, it should be. It's a great album closer. That was my note from it. I really like that song, and I always like an album to close well. So I don't know if it's actually the album closer or if it's just the one that I thought this should be the album closer, because it's a really good song in my opinion. I really enjoy Love Without Dreams, and I know we mentioned it earlier, but I really like that song as well.
Yeah, it is, and it's really weird because that was like the one I said I played this thing a lot back when I was young, but that was like the song I skipped a lot for some reason. I don't know why. I think it's just because on the cassette it was like the last song on the second side,
Sure.
and I was just eager to get past to the first side again. I don't know why I skipped it a lot, but I grew to really love it. That was probably the last song I got into
Hmm.
on the album, and the CD version is a little different from the cassette because
Yeah.
on the CD it is technically the last song, but they tacked on four bonus songs
Yeah.
from their Island Records days. But it wasn't even the Island Records versions; they were just like alternate versions of Island Records songs. So it was like I think it ended up being like a 14 track CD,
Yep.
but the cassette was only 10 songs.
Okay, so that is that's what I thought. I tried to figure this out because you get these on. I only listen to it on streaming, and I was like 14 songs, but then like if you look at the streaming album artwork, they have all 14 songs listed. So I was
Yeah.
like, maybe it was always 14 songs, but that makes sense if it was the CD version. They threw on four more songs, and
Yeah.
and that's why. Because yes, that makes okay. I feel so much better about myself that I wasn't totally crazy.
Yeah, they referred to them as Lost Island treasures. That's what it says on the album. And
Okay.
at that point, I mean, when Sticks and Stones came out, you couldn't find any other 77s album. Like as far as I was concerned, like they were pretty much a new band.
Hmm.
Even though they were in their mid 30s at that time. But like Yeah, like you couldn't. I didn't know of the existence of the other albums until like a little later when I saw them in True Tunes. I was like, oh, they have three more albums.
Yeah. Yep. I will say just because we've mentioned it a handful of times, but MT really is. You're right. It is super hooky. It's a really really good. I'm just gonna say it. It's a really good pop song. It may not be a pop song, but it makes me feel like a pop song when I listen to it. So I will say that it is a really really good opener. And that one, you're right. You nailed it. Super surprising that never made it onto an album as an opening track, and that it was, because again, this is a collection of unreleased stuff. You feel like, man, where you couldn't have found a spot for this to start an album, because man alive, it's a catchy song. So
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I mean, I'm guessing they probably recorded it after the self-titled. I'm
hmm,
not really sure, but they were definitely aiming for a radio hit on that one. I think before like Island Records kind of casually promoted "I Can't Get Over It."
hmm,
That's another one that I thought could have been a hit on like a alternative radio, maybe not top 40 radio, but
yeah.
alternative college radio. That one MT probably I think could have been top 40 if it had the right promotion.
You picked the right time. Got your past behind you. Got your future in front of you. You can't go back. You can't go back. You can't go back. You can't go back. You can go on. You can go
Well, let's move on to our
on.
last question. And I know it gets hard to not repeat yourself here. So you have freedom to repeat yourself if it happens. But somebody has not. It's 35 years later. Somebody has not checked out this record. What are you gonna? What's your sales pitch to them? Like, hey, this is why you need to go back and check this record out.
I mean, if you just like straightforward songcraft,
Hmm.
like if your favorite songs of like the 80s and the 90s and the 70s are the straightforward pop songs, the stuff that Tom Petty did, like the Free Fallins or the With or Without Yous or like Tears for Fears Shout, if you just like the straightforward pop songs, then you would you would probably find something to like here
Yeah.
because I mean it may not the hooks may not announce themselves immediately, but after a couple of listens, it'll draw you in. If you're that person who just likes traditional songcraft, you're not necessarily about experimentation. I mean, not that you would hate it if you like experimentation, but if you just like good songcraft, I think this and you like a lot of older forms of rock music from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I think that you can find something to appreciate here easily.
Yeah. I feel really good about myself now because here are my notes exactly. It did take me a couple listens, but to really get going. But once I did, it really, really grew on me. It must mean that I'm a fan of Songcraft and I didn't even
Yeah,
know it. Because yeah, I will say that the first I think listener to, I was kind of like, okay, I'm gonna have to find some things to say about this. And then it was like my third or fourth time through where all of a sudden I was like, man, I'm really enjoying this. I really am having a good time with this. And so that was absolutely my experience as kind of somebody who engaged with it significantly later. Is the first time through you are kind of almost trying to find yourself, which can be true. Like if you don't
yeah,
know, it's not like picking up the Joshua Tree, however many years later, where like you've heard half of that record in the grocery store at some point, like
yeah,
just because the hits have been playing. Where you won't have run into this. There's a good chance you have not run into this, so it is 100% new, and
yeah,
it did take a couple listens, but man, once it did, I totally can get that sense that I was like, I'm really enjoying this. Like I'd get done with it and I'd be like, yeah, let's listen one more time. And I was working. I will admit I was working on other things potentially, but
yeah,
there was so many moments that kept on going. Oh, I really enjoyed that. Oh, I really like that. So yeah, I think that's a great way to talk about it. That
yeah,
give it a listen or two, and if you don't find something you don't like, I'll be really really surprised if you don't find things that you don't love about it.
yeah,
What I'm really impressed with, I think you did it twice. You just jumped right into lyrics and went through not just like, and then they say something like this. Like there's at least twice now where you've gone like half a verse or the entire chorus, and I've been like genuinely impressed. And that
Yeah.
really does show how much you have clearly sat with this record at some points, because it was genuinely impressive.
Yeah, and that was one of the frustrating things about them is that they didn't put the lyrics in the album. Like you had to they have notes on the songs, which is cool, but
Yeah.
they don't the liner notes don't have the actual lyrics on. Even like the reissue, I don't think even has them. I don't know, I may be wrong about that, but like you had to send them a self-addressed stamped envelope to get the lyrics and like send them like $3 or something. And that's how you got the lyrics. But eventually, when the internet came, I was able to sort out some of those lyrics that I didn't necessarily hear
Sure.
when my first 1,000 go rounds listening to.
That's crazy. The idea that you had to send in for the lyrics. That is awesome. I love stuff like that. Like stuff that today, if you'd explain that to your kids, even that idea of like, I sent them a self-addressed stamped envelope and $3, my kids would be like, "What, you did what now? You didn't fill out a form online and Venmo them something? What are you talking about?"
Which I never did, by the way. I don't think I even knew what SASE stood for. Like I was like 18 years old. I didn't even know what that was.
Oh man. That's the show that Brock and Josh did about Starflyer 59. Like Josh was talking Brock was talking about, this is late 90s, and he's like, "Yeah, I put a check in the mail with a form saying this is the record I want, and I sent it off, and 3 months later a record showed up." And it was just kind of this like novel concept that, now we're so like, I don't know, I order crap online because that's just sometimes it's the only way to get the money into the artist's hand is I'm going to order it from you. But it's just such a crazy idea that he was, "Well, here's this piece of paper. I hope you send me something. See ya."
Yeah. Yeah, they had to you had to sign up for mailing lists back then, and I don't think I was on any of them.
Yeah.
I probably should have been, but yeah,
Yeah.
I never was.
Mailing list and all those things. Great stuff. I know music's a lot more accessible now, but there's something incredibly charming about the idea that you're occasionally sending in for those extra things that's lost today. I do think, and I really avoid streaming stuff. I stream my own music just through YouTube Music. It's music I've downloaded, but man alive, there's something charming about some of these goofy stories of how you found it, and even the idea that you dubbed it, from a friend and then wore it out and was like, "I should dub more of this, not just the first song." And that's hilarious.
Yeah.
Those are the things that make this looking back on some of these records so charming.
Yeah, I just didn't have a lot of money back then.
Well, that's fair too. We literally just had a conversation because there was a website that I was looking at records, and they had they have a ton of jazz records on like super sale. So it's like $10 for a record. And so I'm like piling them in my cart's like up to like 77 items of stuff. And I'm like, nope, I shouldn't be doing this. And I whittled it down. I got it to like $200. And I was like, no, I shouldn't. I closed browser. I can't do it, and like, it's tough. Like even today, like there's always stuff to get. There's always stuff to buy, but you have to say no sometimes. So, I love the idea that you dubbed it from a friend. I think that's pretty awesome. And you've gone back and bought it 6 times, it sounds like. So they've gotten your money from it,
Yeah, they have.
Awesome.
I've probably streamed it too when I was on. I haven't really used Spotify lately, but I did used to use it.
Yeah, well, and it happens. It's so convenient. I totally understand why people do it. So.
Say yes with your heart. Well, you can't have love without dreams, and you've got to have some dreams inside paradise. No, you can't have love without dreams, and you can't see your dreams without paying the price. You can't have love without.
That is a great breakdown. That's our breakdown of Sticks and Stones by the 77s. Again, released sometime in 1990. I don't have an exact date, so it's celebrating a 35-year anniversary this year. So this is our date that we've I've picked. I've thrown it on the calendar. Just a chance to talk about it. Kit, I know you told people last time where people can find you online, but just again, I know you have a Twitter handle. Have you moved over to Blue Sky? Are you on Instagram? Throw out a couple of those social media. I can't just limit it to Twitter anymore. People have moved on in a lot of ways. I'm sad to see people going, but I will admit I understand.
I'm not on Blue Sky yet. I probably will at some point. Yeah, I'm on Twitter as CryptoKid. I guess I reply
Yeah.
a lot on there. I'm also on Instagram, Kites Without Strings, and I have a Rate Your Music account on Fever Pitch.
There you go. I don't even know what this
But
is. How can people find you there? I'm
uh,
unfamiliar.
Rate Your Music is kind of like Letterboxd for like music fans. It's
Oh,
been around since probably the late '90s. I've been a member since 2002.
okay.
A lot of the people that we interact with on that you and I interact with on Twitter or on Rate Your Music.
Rate music. So rate your
Um,
music I've heard of. Okay.
yeah, Rate Your Music. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, there you go. Go find Kit. Obviously, a lot to say. And if you need somebody to just come up with lyrics, 35-year-old lyrics off the top of his head, he can do that, even though he never sent in for the lyrics on the self-addressed stamped envelope. That is super impressive. I love it.
I
Awesome.
thank you.
Oh, man. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Kit. And yeah, I'm so glad we got to talk about this album.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Album Anniversary Podcast. Thanks again to Kit for joining me to talk about this album. It was great to have him on the show. And this is what I love. I got done with this call and I just felt energized, like excited just to hear somebody going and kind of diving into an album that they love, that they clearly have a connection to. It was great. I mean, those stories of self-addressed stamped envelopes and those kind of nuances that just make music great and make it tangible. It's not just the music, it's the experience. It was so great to have him on the show. Thanks so much, Kit. Really appreciate you joining me and talking through this album. Absolutely great. Let us know what you thought. What did we get right? What did we get wrong? What do you appreciate about this album? What are your favorites from this album as well? You can find me on Twitter still at Caleb the Spy. No spaces in that name. I'm also on Instagram, Caleb the Spy. There's underscores in between the names because I think there's another couple Caleb the Spy references on Instagram. So that's why I had to go with that username. You can always email the show, Caleb the Spy Podcast, that is with an S at the end, at gmail.com. No spaces or underscores in that. If you want to be on the show, you can reach out to me. I do have a spreadsheet going for 2025. I will say I got guests for 90% of the albums I'm hoping to cover, but I'm always looking for more people. Somebody falls through and I need to find another guest. If you're interested, email me and I can invite you to that spreadsheet and we can add your name to it. And, hopefully that's probably how I'll do it in 2026 too, if I'm still doing the show. So please reach out if you're interested in being on the show. The other way to do it is to follow me on Twitter. Again, I just had somebody cancel for a show that's coming up. Actually, the show will be out by now, hopefully, but I had somebody cancel. And so I threw it out there and I was looking for somebody to jump in and be a guest on the show. And so I still do that on Twitter sometimes. I'll throw it out on Twitter and just say, hey, I'm looking for somebody to join me for this album. Some people got back to me and now we're just trying to make it work. Oh, that all happened in the past because this is coming out in January. I'm really good at this. You should keep on listening to my show. Please subscribe and share the podcast. Please leave a rating or review. It's great to see those on wherever you listen, whether you're listening on Spotify, on Apple, or any other of the podcast places. I don't know what they're called. It's not podcast networks. Please leave a rating or review. I have heard it actually is an effective way to spread the word about podcasts. They do use those reviews in the algorithms. So I really do appreciate if you can take the time to even just leave a rating. It does help me out. If you enjoy this show, you might also enjoy the other podcast I do. It's with my friend Scott. It's called I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. And it's not just a podcast where we reminisce about our youth and our youth group experience, but we're going out and we're interviewing fellow 90s and 2000s youth group kids. And we're going in with no agenda except for we just want to hear people's story. We want to hear about that youth group experience. We want to hear about where people are at, whether they've left the faith or they're still at the same church. We just want to hear people's stories. And we're always excited to hear about how that youth group experience has impacted their lives and kind of how for some people it's shaped their lives, or for other people it's had a different impact. And we just want to hear their stories, a chance to understand that youth group experience better. Again, no agenda, just want to do it. So if you like this show, you might also enjoy that show. The music at the beginning and the end of this show is the instrumental version of the song Sing It Out at Street Level by Peg and the Rejected. thanks again for listening. I really appreciate it, and we'll talk to you soon.
The end of Perfect Blues has this incredible drum break. That's one of those where I'm just like, how did I never reach this point in the song before? Because I again as a kid I would kind of listen to the beginning and just okay, this is too
Yeah,
old timey sounding for me.
that was great. Oh man, I'm gotta go talk to my kids now about self-addressed stamped envelopes. Oh my gosh, that's such a great poll, man. All right, and
Yeah,
then
they've even joked about making that like a title of a tribute album or something for them. Yeah.
I just think that's such a riot to me that they would put because like there's a lot. I mean, so hey, Five Iron Frenzy did not come up on this episode. I think good job me. Um, Reese Roper from Five Iron Frenzy has even said like he hates explaining the song. Like he hates that. He
Yeah.
would rather just give the lyrics and then like he's like I don't want to explain it. He's like I kind of want to let it be like if you interpret it some other way, great.
Yeah.
I think that's good. My meaning doesn't have to be your meaning. This is what I wrote, and yeah, there's at times where I'm super ambiguous, and you can apply your own means. There's times where no, this is what I meant, and it's pretty clear. So it's so funny the flip side of just two totally different approaches. But yeah,
Yeah, there are a lot of lyricists that way. I remember Brian Healy from Dead Artist Syndrome didn't like to explain his songs either.
yeah,
People would always ask him what this one specific song was about. He would just kind of let them run away with their own interpretation of
right. I get it. I
it.
know from Reese's perspective, it's kind of this whole I don't want to be a hero. I don't want to be a worshipped. Like
Yeah.
I don't want that. My favorite is if you go look at, there's that one website where if you look up lyrics, it's not Song Meaning, but it's one of the other lyrics websites, and they will like people will like add in
Genius.
like, what's that? Yeah,
Genius, maybe.
yeah. If you go look up "Sin" by Poor Old Lou, almost every song has a comment from Scott Hunter, like somebody. It's not him out there, but somebody pulling a quote from
Yeah.
him, and
Yeah.
almost everyone is. I'm not entirely sure what I meant by this. Like it's across the board. He's like multiple times. He's like, I just thought it sounded kind of cool. I think it's about this. I don't know. It's like,
Yeah,
all
he
right.
was really good about being vague with this lyrical approach. I
Yeah,
don't know what some of those songs mean,
yeah. Oh, and he doesn't either.
but
So you're on the same page with him.
yeah.
So, all right, I'm gonna hit stop. Thanks for listening to this episode of I Survived Youth Group in the '90s, which is not this show. I'm dumb.